Madam President, I ask unanimous consent that the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, Madam President. I just rise to speak briefly about a heartrending situation in Pennsylvania that I want to call my colleagues' attention to. As I speak here this morning, there is a brave little 10-year-old girl who's fighting for her life in Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. Sarah Murnahan suffers from cystic fibrosis, and she's been in the hospital for 3 months now, and recently she's been put on a machine that helps her to breathe with great difficulty. But she's at a point now where she needs a lung transplant. There's no question about that. The doctors, in fact, have said that she might only have a few weeks to live without a new lung. At this moment, her government is failing her, and here's the reason I say that. We have law and we have policy that requires that the Health and Human Services branch of the federal government, through a third party, develop rules governing how organs are transplanted. This organization that has the direct authority is the Organ Procurement and Transportation Network. So they set up the rules by which we deal with this excruciating situation where there's always more demand for transplanted organs than there are supply of organs. Prior to a decision yesterday afternoon, which I will comment on, Sarah, despite a very high need for a transplant, and despite the fact that her doctors believe she's a very good candidate for a transplant, her name was not on the list of people to receive a transplant, simply by virtue of one fact, and that is she has not yet reached the age of 12. See, the current policy has one very sensible feature. The current policy is meant to establish as the highest priority for recipients people who have the most urgent need. That makes sense. You could have other criteria, like how long you've been waiting or how much you're willing to pay, but I don't think those would be better. Those would be worse. The right criteria is who's got the most urgent need. So that's right. The problem is it applies only to people who are 12 and over. But there are children under the age of 12 who are very good candidates for adult lung transplants. The medical science is very clear on this. You take a portion of the lung if the child is too small for a full lung transplant. And this is well established. This works. This girl is a good candidate for this. But she's not on the list. Now, yesterday something very important happened. Sarah's parents filed a suit against Health and Human Services challenging the rule that excludes their daughter from this list. And the judge considering this, a judge from the Eastern District of Pennsylvania, federal judge, Judge Bailson, granted a temporary restraining order enjoining the Secretary and the Organ Procurement and Transportation Network from applying the rule that excludes Sarah. So this is terrific. This is a big breakthrough for 10 days now. This is the thing. It's a temporary order. And for 10 days now, Sarah cannot be excluded from this list. So what that means is she can go on the list, and she will go wherever on the list the urgency of her circumstances puts her. And that's as it should be. The problem is this is only for 10 days. And then the judge is going to have a hearing. We don't know how that is all going to turn out. So what I'm asking is Secretary Sebelius, the Secretary of Health and Human Services, to exercise the authority that is given to her in legislation to recognize that there's a flaw in this policy. I am not asking Secretary Sebelius to make an exception for one individual. I would be the first to suggest that that would be a dangerous place to go. We don't want individual cabinet members or politicians or anyone else making decisions about who's going to get an organ and who's not. What we want is a system that works, and the current system doesn't work for kids who are good transplant candidates and have the acute need but aren't yet 12 years old. And so I am urging Secretary Sebelius as strongly as I can to exercise the discretion that the law gives to her to change the policy. And don't change it For one person, change it for a category. I think any child who is a viable candidate for the adult transplant and who has sufficient urgency ought to be able to go on the adult list. That's not to say that they automatically go to the top of the list. Their ranking on the list ought to be determined by the urgency of their circumstances, as it should be for everyone else. So I would argue we're not suggesting that we make an exception for Sarah. What I'm suggesting in a way is the opposite. Stop making exceptions that exclude Sarah. She's a good candidate for this. The doctors believe this, and you know, CHOP, Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, is one of the best children's hospitals in the world. Nobody disputes that. Her doctors are some of the best doctors in the world. And this is really, really vitally important. The life of a small child depends on this. And I don't know how many other children might be in similar circumstances. So, Madam President, I appreciate the opportunity to rise and make this case. Again, I just want to stress, we're not asking for an exception for one individual to be chosen over others. We're asking for a change in a policy that is flawed and that is currently excluding somebody from being on the list for to be an organ donor recipient that ought to be on that list. I am grateful to Judge Bailson for the decision he made, but that is a temporary restraining order that will only last 10 days. And if the transplant does not occur within that 10 days, then Sarah and any other children in her circumstances, their future becomes uncertain after that. So I would urge the Secretary to take the action that's necessary, and I would note the absence of a quorum, Madam President.